One thing I work on with a lot of my clients individually is the rumination cycle that anxiety often creates. And if you have anxiety, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's when you're sitting there and something comes up and you're starting to feel worried about it, and you sit in the what ifs or the catastrophe of what could happen. And so we sit in this cycle and we just keep going around and around until we're exhausted enough that we tap out, or we get ourselves worked up enough that we almost have a panic attack. And this cycle isn't beneficial for anybody, and it usually isn't actually addressing what's really going on with us. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about some ways that you can work yourself out of that rumination cycle through feeling your feelings. And so a lot of people who are struggling with anxiety often struggle with, like, how do I sit with it, right? Because the rumination feels like sitting with it. And trust me, I have had plenty of days myself that I have sat in this like rumination cycle over and over and over again. And what I work on with people and with myself is when that rumination cycle comes up, it's often this grasp of control. It's kind of our brain thinking, if I can make you anxious about this, if I can push you into fight or flight, we will be okay. We'll have control over this situation. We will know all the bad things that could happen before they happen, and then we'll know how to intervene with them, and we'll know we'll be okay. And so when you're noticing the cycle going on and it's just going nonstop, what I encourage you to do is really work on taking a couple of deep breaths to slow yourself down just a little bit. It's not going to help the rumination. It's not going to make it go anywhere. That's not the goal. And then I really want you to sit with the question of, what if all of this does happen? What does that really mean for me? What if the things that I'm worrying about, what if they are true? Because oftentimes we're trying to battle anxiety with, like, that's not logical, or that's not reasonable, or I shouldn't feel that way. And so when we slow down enough to really ask ourselves, if that happened, right? If that was true, if all of the things I'm worried about really surface, what's underneath that? And oftentimes it's shame or grief, these really deep, hollow feelings, heavy feelings that our anxiety supports us in avoiding. Really, our anxiety is this protective layer that's like, I can keep you up here so that you can still do stuff, so that you can still be active, because if these things are true, what does that mean about the world? What does that mean about me? And as a culture, a society, we're really avoidant of grief. We don't like to feel the pain of grief because it often feels really hopeless in some ways. It feels like, there's nothing to do to change it. And really, instead of moving around our grief by being anxious and trying to have control, if we can move through our grief and own it, we can usually get to another side where we don't need to have the same control anymore. We have a greater trust in our ability to manage whatever's coming our way, and understanding that life is uncertain and there isn't a lot of certainty that we can grasp onto all of the time. The only thing that we can kind of hold on to is the knowing of how we can take care of ourselves and nurture ourselves and lean into the people that we need when we need them. And so for some people, what's underneath this anxiety rumination cycle, especially when it comes to having social anxiety, is this idea of, like, I'm going to be left behind by everybody. I'm going to be abandoned by everybody. Nobody's going to like me. And we try to control that by being really anxious about, what am I saying? How am I showing up? What am I wearing? Right? We try to go off this whole list of, like, if I can be absolutely perfect, then this thing won't happen. When we can move through the grief of the thing happening, even if it's completely illogical and untrue, we can get to a place of self-acceptance and compassion so that we can show up more authentically. And then in that showing up more authentically, we find the people who embrace our authentic self. But if we continue to sit in the rumination because we don't want to be with the grief, we don't want to feel the reality that could be there, we often are holding ourselves back from living a truly aligned life. And then we have people in our life that aren't really fitting for us, that maybe are hurtful to us. We are stuck in situations that we aren't happy. We feel, trapped at work or trapped at home. we follow societal standards that we don't really believe in. And so the slowing down and feeling what's really underneath the surface is key. And so what I would really encourage you to do is every time you notice that this rumination cycle is coming up, you take that pause, you take a couple of deep breaths, and you go, and what if all of that happens? What's the catastrophe? What's the grief? What's the shame that's underneath that? And if that grief and shame is too big for you to sit with alone, and for a lot of us it is, especially when we're new in our healing journey, it's too much for us to hold because we don't know how to hold it with compassion. That's a sign to you that it may be really helpful for you to see somebody who kind of specializes in some of this to help you through some of that grief so that you can live more authentically, and so that your anxiety doesn't have the same control over you and you don't have to have the same control over life. DM me with any kind of questions or comments, and I'm happy to put together a series or a couple of posts about any of your questions to kind of help you further explore this a little bit more.